I want to talk a bit about media race baiting. Now, just a sort of disclaimer here. Media is an abstract term, it's not a single sort of unit or body. The media encompasses a wide range of outlets, newspapers, publications, and I'm usually reluctant to talk in that generalized sense, but for the sake of simplicity, I will here. So I still think some outlets are more responsible than others, but um, I do think the media has a lot of culpability in stirring up racial tensions, or let's say using exaggerations and hyperbole to report certain situations where it is not all as their headline would imply. So, as an example of this, there was a report yesterday on Yahoo News by Jimmy Subuga, that's Nsubuga. And the headline reads Coronavirus, man jailed for accusing council worker of bringing COVID-19 into the UK. Now, when you read about this, it turns out this guy had made racial abuse of, he turned up at Bristol City Council on March the 20th, that was just before the lockdown. He apparently told a council worker to go home and accused him of bringing coronavirus into the UK. So, an ugly rant. But then 2 weeks later, he was found at a hotel in Bristol where he assaulted a police officer by putting the officer's hand in a door, causing tissue damage and I believe a fracture. Well, it turns out that appearing at Bristol Magistrates Court on Friday, Spiteri of no fixed address was jailed for 8 weeks for the racially aggravated public order incident, but 21 weeks for actual bodily harm caused to the officer, which will be served consecutively. And that to me is about right. I think a heavier sentence should be for the physical attack. Um, but that's an example of a clickbait headline because the headline would imply he was jailed solely for the racial taunts, which would cause a good deal of debate, I would imagine. I mean, me personally, do I think people should be jailed for using unpleasant words? I don't think they should. I think they should get a fine made to apologize to the target, but I don't think people should be jailed for that in itself if there's an absence of physical violence or threats. I'm not justifying it, it's an ugly thing, and the man's clearly a bigot, but should it result in jail? No. Um, the assault on the officer, yes, that's a physical assault. An assault on anyone. If the assault had been on the council worker, yes. But the point is, the bulk of the sentence of 21 weeks part was for the assault on the officer. So why does the headline say he was jailed for racism? That's just the sort of thing that, you know, uh, it's clickbait. But that's not even the most palpable example. I recall Metro News, they had a YouTube video and it was a disgraceful headline. They said, "Man racially abuses Polish commuter for drinking on tube." Well, firstly, it's well known that you are not allowed to drink on the tube. It's against the rules. This video is a few years old. It's kind of viral. I left a comment there and I got 500 likes. So clearly, there's other people who feel the same way. And I said that basically the extent of this is the British commuter challenged this man, and the Polish guy got quite aggro. He stood up and he wanted a fight over it. Thankfully enough, it didn't escalate. It didn't go beyond that. The two guys kind of just parted ways. But the British guy was being calm. Now you could argue he should have minded his own business, but the point is the Polish guy was breaking the rules, and he had a real attitude about it. Now, people say, "Oh, he could have had a long day or something," but breaking rules is breaking rules. Um, and I thought the Polish guy had a pretty bad attitude. He was aggro. He was, basically saying he could do what he wanted. The only thing the British guy shouldn't have done was made it a nationality issue per se. For example, he said, "I was born and bred here," and yada yada yada. But it wasn't. I wouldn't call that, profound racial hatred. If you look at the video, the British guy wasn't being aggressive. He was being calm. He was simply explaining to the man why you can't do that. Um, some would say he was being a good citizen. What does the Metro do? The Metro smears him as a racist. which I have to say kind of disgusted me because these newspapers have a lot of power, and all it takes is for them to smear someone as a racist, and their reputation, their career, everything could be down the drain. Um, where there's obvious examples of racism, fair enough, but the media love it. You know, they love these sort of headlines that, oh, well, it's a racial incident, and they will deny that, but they love it. Okay, editors love racial tension. They love it because for them it means selling newspapers, and they're lying if they say otherwise. It's a business, you know. And I'm not saying that there aren't more responsible editors out there. I'm not saying that there aren't editors who take a more professional approach and say, no, that's not racism. And to be fair, there will be some who openly challenge that sort of mantra. But more often than not, you see this. You see it in broadcast news as well. And by the way, about that incident, it's, you know, binge drinking on public transport is a major problem in this country. Many Britons do it. So maybe that was a mistake the British guy made, sort of making it out like, you know, you're in our country, you obey the rules, which is true. I think that's a totally valid point. However, many Britons also break those rules. So, um, but it absolutely disgusts me how the media smear people as racist. I mean, it's, there is nothing, and I mean nothing, more inflammatory, more damaging to someone's reputation than accusing them of racism. Nothing. Even sexism, even homophobia, they can be damaging, but not as much as the R word. It is just such a potent, such a powerful thing to level at someone. And I'm not saying it isn't out there. I'm not saying there aren't people who are racist and they fully deserve that tag. But I do think that the media really plays it up. Look at CNN. Look at the way they have reported sensitive racial issues, and they will immediately see a situation with minority protesters and white protesters. They will immediately assume the white protesters must be some sort of far right types. There was an incident somewhere in the Midwest, I forget which state now, but it ended up with there was actually an incident involving a Native American, a controversial Native American activist. Black Lives Matter group and some white college students. Well, CNN were immediately saying these young white guys were alt-right racists, they were Proud Boys, they were far right, etc. What actually transpired was that the troublemakers, if you saw the full version of events, the Native American guy had been shit stirring. He'd been stoking up tensions. And actually, if you look at the full sequence of events, it absolutely wasn't how CNN was reporting it. Don Lemon, you know, powerful anchor on broadcast news, was saying he wanted to assault these young guys. Now, it ended up, I believe, that they took a legal claim against CNN. I personally hope they sued the hell out of CNN because this is the sort of damaging thing that powerful media outlets do, and it really is a David and Goliath situation. It really disgusts me, to be quite honest, the way the media behave in these situations. And by the way, I'm not endorsing Trump's mantra of, oh, it's all fake news. I support the media when they do report the facts and when they do hold the likes of Donald Trump to account. Okay, so I think it's totally legitimate to quote someone's own words. That's legitimate. And I've defended CNN in some of their exchanges with Trump because I think Trump just doesn't like getting difficult questions. I think the man's a wannabe dictator. Um, having said that, I also think that CNN and left wing outlets have shamelessly promoted race baiting. I mean, if you look at the example of the New York Times, they fired a columnist who had written derogatory things about African Americans. Yet a few months later, they kept Sarah Jong, who famously made very vitriolic rants about all white people. Now, her very sloppy excuse, her non-apology, was that she was simply responding to alt-right trolls. But if that was the case, why not just respond to them rather than smear all white people? She could easily have said, I have been harassed by alt-right trolls, this is what they've said, and this is what I think of them. But no, she chose to demonize all white people, This was inflammatory. This was blatantly racist. Yet the New York Times made a half-hearted apology and they kept her on. And then her apologists came out of the woodwork to say, oh, she was goaded by the alt-right types. No, in the end of the day, if you're an adult, you take responsibility for your own words. And it's not an excuse to say that because you've had a hard time from some white people, it's okay to demonize all white people. And that's effectively what she was doing. And I was disgusted by the fact the New York Times kept her on. This shows that so much for white privilege. What we're actually seeing is a huge amount of double standards. My view on this is pretty simple. Racism is racism is racism. If you're against racism, you're against racism, period. There shouldn't be, well, we're against racism, but some kinds of racism are okay. Or this nonsense, this ridiculous nonsense that minority people aren't capable of being racist. And the argument goes, well, white people have always had the power, they've always had the institutions, therefore, black racists and Asian racists and Hispanic racists have no culpability over their own words. They've just been, they're victims of the white establishment, so they can't help their own words. This nonsense mentality really needs to be challenged, and we see it on both sides of the Atlantic. The disgraceful way that Lauren Fox was treated, for example, on Question Time. Now, the outcome with that, Equity did finally see sense and they apologised to him for what he went through. He was losing sleep over that. Um, he really did go through a period where he was utterly vilified by the likes of The Guardian and The Independent. And then the two um, people who had a kind of breakaway group within Equity, the two disgraceful actors who wanted to basically blacklist Lawrence Fox, um, they have now had a tantrum and they claim that Equity's throwing them under the bus. But they're the ones trying to blacklist a fellow actor. They're the ones trying to destroy a man's reputation for no other reason than saying he wouldn't apologize for being a white man. Lawrence Fox hasn't promoted some sort of white supremacist statement. He hasn't endorsed some sort of neo-Nazi organization or anything of the sort. All he said was identity politics is problematic and he will not apologize for being a white man. That's all. Um, so I'm disgusted by people like that who actually have arrogance to make themselves out to be the victims when they're the ones trying to ruin someone else's livelihood and reputation for no other reason than that. I'm not, I've no sympathy for people who really genuinely are alt-right types. I mean, we do have hardcore white racists in society. If you look at an organization like Combat 18, which is basically a terrorist organization, they're a bunch of neo-Nazi thugs. They into them. I've no problem with the media exposing them, reporting on them, you know, reporting on what they are. They're a bunch of neo-Nazi thugs, and if you're stupid enough to believe that they're just patriots defending the country from Islamist extremism, you need to look deeper. You know, they're a vile organization that, far from being patriotic, they support the very ideology this country fought against. So I despise that sort of blood and soil white nationalism. I have no time for it. I want nothing to do with it. But by the same token, I despise the double standards that identity politics promotes. I despise the double standards that we've seen in the Labour Party and in the Democratic Party in recent years, where they have criticised white racism, but they've turned a blind eye to minority racism. It's quite simple. If you're a decent human being, oppose racism, period. But we also need to stop being so damn sensitive and reading every single situation as racism. So, for example, just because a white person and a minority person have an argument about something doesn't mean it must be racism. And I'm very suspicious of these videos where you see, a supposed white racist arguing with a Hispanic or black person, and you might find the actual context is more complex than that. There was a video emerged a few years ago which supposedly showed these three African American girls get racial abuse on a bus, and they claimed that they were surrounded by a white mob. That's how they put it. When you actually dug a little bit deeper and when the full footage emerged, it turned out they were actually the aggravators. They were being aggressive, and the supposed racists that they were targeting were actually being subjected to their abuse. And they ended up actually facing legal proceedings for, I believe the charge was, I can't recall now if it was wasting police time or for assault. It was maybe both. Um, but the university in question immediately had the solidarity rally. All these brave young women, look, they've been victims of racial assault. I'm sure the young men were vilified. And then when it got exposed, the black spokespeople at that university said, "Oh, let's not judge." Oh, but you were quick to judge when it was a young white man being accused of racism. So I think, sadly, in America, this is such a toxic issue. So many people tribalize, they immediately jump into thinking they know the whole story when maybe they don't. And I think Black Lives Matter has been a predominantly negative force. If they were simply protesting police brutality, it would be one thing, but they are basically promoting double standards. They're promoting the idea that it's okay to vilify white people, but you know that only one kind of racism is acceptable, which is anti-white racism. And they've promoted the idea that anti-white racism doesn't exist, even though there are blatant examples of it. So, as a white guy, I'm not here to defend any sort of notion of white power or anything of the sort, and I'm not interested in white identity politics. Okay, I don't go around saying I'm a white guy. That's my identity. It just is what I am. Okay, I can't change that. I don't, I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to apologize for it either. I'm not ashamed of it. Basically, it just is. I'm neither proud of it or ashamed of it. And I appreciate people have different circumstances in life. If you're growing up, say, the only black kid in an all-white school, obviously it's going to shape your perspective on the world. But likewise, if you grow up the only white kid in an all-black school, that's also going to shape your perspective. This needs to be understood. So I'm not saying that there isn't an issue of identity. I'm not saying, for example, someone who is mixed race, or maybe let's say they're Chinese American or Chinese British, British Chinese. Obviously, they're going to have that kind of duality of heritage, and that's okay. So I'm not, when I attack identity politics, I'm not saying that we're all the same and we should all just. I'm not saying that. We do have diverse backgrounds, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with people wanting to be interested in their heritage. That's not what I'm talking about. What I take issue with is when you use your identity politics to play the victim all the time, to think that the world owes you something. Okay? And when I see this permeating into university campuses, like Sheffield University actually trying to dictate to students how to think, actually getting other students to spy on their peers, give them verbal warnings. Apparently, one of the trigger signs is, even if you complain about it, even if you say, don't overthink or don't be overly sensitive, or not everything is a racial issue. The University of Sheffield, in all its wisdom, counts that as a triggering thing. So this is totalitarianism, and I think these universities need to be shamed, because what I see happening is many totalitarians taking over our university campuses. I think the Spectator described it as left-wing madrasas. That's unfortunately what our universities are becoming. There's diversity, but there isn't diversity of opinion, and it's deeply alarming. And these arrogant university executives who don't live in the real world, they live in a bubble. Very often the Marxists, they tend to be baby boomer generation Marxist professors. They're breeding this generation. It's almost like the Red Guards in China in the 60s, short of the violence. Um, they're breeding this generation of mostly millennials who are extremely intolerant, extremely sensitive, and promote these sort of toxic victimhood narratives. It's just very, it deeply concerns me, really does, because they're not preparing people for the future. They're preparing people to be mini totalitarians who go around language policing everyone. So by all means, let's confront actual racism. If people are expressing attitudes that really can be perceived as racist, okay. But we need to be very, very careful about language policing, and I think the how hate crime is perceived. I mean, as it stands, hate crime is designated as anything a person can feel is targeting them. So it's down to feelings. This is not clearly defined, and that is a problem.